In this clip, we're going to learn how to control our animations through a script. All right, so we've set up a parameter and a condition inside of our animation and the transition itself. So what we need to do now is we need to go to our scripts folder, and let's right-click and create a new C# script. Let's go ahead and call this player anim controller. And actually, let's do player anim manager. That's probably a better word for it. Using player anim controller is perfectly fine. It wouldn't be a conflict with a keyword as far as scripting goes, but it could be kind of confusing for people who were coming in and trying to figure out, what does this script do? And because there is an animation controller or animator controller, and then also a script called animator controller, that could be a little confusing. So let's go ahead and double click on this script, and we'll bring it up in Visual Studio. And let's talk about what we can do to get this to control our animation. There are a couple of things that we'll need to access in our script. Now, at this point, you've only learned a very small amount about scripting, and that's perfectly fine. So if you don't understand exactly what is happening, that's okay. I'm going to explain exactly what everything is doing as I write the code, and then why we're doing it, and it should make a little bit of sense, but if it doesn't, that's totally fine. I don't expect you to know at this point. So let's start out with a couple of things that we need to think about. We first need to get the nav mesh itself that is on this player object, because it is going to be used to get the velocity of the player object. And so I need to be able to access that. And then I'm also going to need to access the animator controller that is on the player object. We're probably going to need some sort of variable that tells us if the player character is moving or not moving. So the first thing that we'll need to do is we'll need to use the Unity Engine.ai namespace. So we're going to use the using keyword, and then we'll type in Unity Engine. And you can start to type it out, and it will show you a list. And then you can use the arrow keys to move up and down that list, and then press enter to use that. Now I'm going to do Unity Engine.ai, and as you can see, it's right here at the top. So all I have to do is left click on that, or double click on it, and it will automatically add that code. Let's end with a semicolon. So now we have Unity Engine and Unity Engine.ai. That's going to allow us to access the nav mesh components and some of the methods that go along with that. Now, under the player anim manager, we need to create a few variables. Now, what I like to do is I like to drop these curly brackets down and then start creating my variables. I just like it that way. It's totally a personal preference. So the first variable that we're going to create is going to be a private variable, meaning that it won't be accessible from another script. And then we're going to add the data type, which is animator. And then we're going to give it a variable name. Typically, in most scripts, I see the keyword anim being used in Unity. So we'll need that. The next thing that we're going to need access to is the nav mesh agent. Now, we could do the same thing here using private, or we could just type in public, and then we could say nav mesh agent for the data type, and then we'll give it a name. And typically with something like a nav mesh agent, I just use the exact same name except for a lowercase n in this case. And that's perfectly fine. That's not contradicting. Only if you were to type in the uppercase n would it have a problem, as you can see right here with this keyword. So there's that. And then we'll do one more variable. Let's go ahead and make this one public just so that way we can see it. But then eventually we would probably change it to private. So let's say public. And then we're going to do a bool value. And we just want to check to see if the player is walking. So I'm going to type in the word is walking with a lowercase I on this. Perfect. So we have our variables set up, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the start function, and I'm going to begin initializing some of these variables. So this first one, I'm going to say anim equals, so we're setting something to the anim variable. As it sits right now, this is empty, and so I need to get the component. So I'm going to use the getComponent method, and with that we need to type in a left arrow, or this is also known as the less than symbol, and then you type in what you're actually looking for. What component are you trying to get? In this case, we want to get the NavMesh agent that is on the object that this script is attached to. And so we're going to say NavMesh agent, and then outside of that, we're going to open close parentheses because the get component is actually a method. Okay, and so we're going to end with a semicolon. Now looking at this, you can see that we are getting some squiggly lines here. And typically that means that there is some sort of problem with this line of code. What this is probably trying to tell me is we don't see where this NavMesh agent is. It's not associated, and that's because we haven't actually applied this to any sort of object or anything like that. And so I'm just going to ignore that for now, but we will come back to it. It wasn't NavMesh agent. I was looking for an animator. That's why it's going squiggly. There we go, animator. Now it's much happier. Now I got a little ahead of myself. Let's do the same thing with NavMesh agent. And we're assigning the variable, and we're going to say get component, and we're going to do the same thing. This time we're going to type in NavMesh agent, and then we're going to do open close parentheses, and there we go. So then we have the public bool variable saying is walking, and I'm going to not set that right now. It's going to be set in a different function. So the function that we're going to be using now is the update function, and so this is something that constantly has to be checked. And so I want to just check to see if the NavMesh agent's velocity is not equal to 0. And what that means is it actually moving? Has the player clicked, and has the NavMesh moved, and does it have some sort of velocity attached to it? So let's type that in. Let's say if NavMesh agent, and we can hit enter to start speeding things up a little bit. I'm going to say NavMesh agent dot, and then I get all of these keywords and methods that I have access to. And we also have variables that are available in here. So I'm going to say velocity, and you can notice that it's shown up there. And so this is looking for the actual velocity of the NavMesh agent. And if it's not, so we'll use an exclamation point, equal to, and then we're going to say vector3 dot 0. And what that means is that a vector 3 is essentially a point in 3D space. And so a vector is represented by 3 values in the x direction, the y direction, and the z direction. And so if all of those are set to 0, that means that something is sitting still. And so we're going to say vector3 dot 0. This is a shorthand version of saying vector3 0 0 0 x, y, and z. So then we're going to type in a semicolon, or excuse me, not a semicolon, a curly bracket after that, because now we want to set it to something. So if it's not equal to 0, we're going to say is walking equals true. So we're going to set that value. Now we're going to use an else statement in this case, and we're just going to say if it's anything else, it is not walking. So we're going to say is walking equals false. And that's it. Now, this does not actually do anything for our parameter that is in our condition. Now, let's go back to our condition very quickly. Let's go back to Unity, and I'm going to go to the animator. Now, the parameter that we created was a float value, But what we're writing for is actually a Boolean value, and we're just checking to see if it's actually walking or not walking. So I'm going to delete this player velocity, and we can do that by right-clicking on it, hitting delete, and we're going to say yes. Now it's saying, hey, this is being used by a couple of transitions. Are you sure? Yes. Let's add a new one. Let's do bool. And in this case, we are going to type in is walking. And actually, let's do uppercase S, walking. Okay? Or excuse me, uppercase I and uppercase W. And let's leave it set to false. So then let's go to our first transition and let's change our condition that's here. So let's say is walking, and we're going to say is true. Then it will go to the walk animation, and then we're going to say is walking, and we're going to set that to false, and then it should go back to the idle animation. So how do we control this parameter here through script? The way that we'll do that is by going to the script, and we're going to update that value. And so we'll say anim dot set bool. And so what we're doing is we're setting the value, or setting the parameter, which is a Boolean parameter, which we just created, and we have to tell it which one. This is done through a string, and so you'll type in open parentheses, open quotations, and then inside of that you're going to give it the parameter name. It's important to know that this must be typed out exactly as it is in the animator condition or parameter. So uppercase I, uppercase W on that. After the close quotations, you need to set whether it is true or whether it is false. In our case, we created a variable to tell if something is actually walking or if it's not walking. So in our case, we want to just check to see what this variable is. And so all I have to do is say is walking. This variable will either change to true or false. And so if the NavMesh agent's velocity is greater than 0, then this will be set to true, and then so is walking in our parameters will also be set to true. And then whenever it is set to 0, this will then change to false, and then it will cause the is walking parameter to change to false. So now all we have to do is hit Control S to save our script, and then we need to apply that to our character. So let's go to the scene view, and let's select the character, and we're going to go Add Component, Scripts, and then we're going to use Player Anim Manager. Now we'll need to associate the NavMesh agent object to this script. So in this case, we have a NavMesh agent object on the character. And I could just simply do what we did for the animator, but I wanted to show you how to associate this. So you'll select the Dwarf Hero character and drag and drop that into this space. And if it's allowed to go, the reason for that is because it sees that there is a NavMesh component on that game object. So now let's hit play, and what we'll see whenever we click, you'll see the character walking and animating. Now there is a little bit of sliding. The speed itself doesn't really match up, but what we can do is we can start to modify our animations and start to create blend trees that will blend from a walk animation into a run animation based on a speed value. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at blend trees next.